Hello, everyone. This is Robin. So, as we go into our last segment on our resiliency and wellness series, I do want to take a moment just to thank you for joining me. It's been an honor to be able to share this work with you, to be able to lead these conversations. And my intention was to be able to offer some research informed ideas that could really help cultivate and foster the resiliency that we practice. I do also just want to pause and recognize the good work it takes to live rightly. I appreciate the service, how you choose to show up. And sometimes the only thing we can ask of ourselves is to just make the next right decision. So thank you for all of the work you do, for what you are contributing to our communities. I want you to know that I thank you for all of it, and it matters. And I believe that wholeheartedly we will find a way to be able to practice the everyday resiliency that we need. So, the last segment that I chose to put here for you is something that I call authoring your resilient story. Now, storytelling, or what we call in education narrative pedagogy, is the oldest form of teaching. When we look back all the way before the Stoics, all the way back to those ancient philosophers, they were telling stories. When we look at indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous knowledge holders, they hold sacred stories. Every world tradition has some type of oral legacy. And one of the things that I've come upon in my work is how important it is when you're ready, if you choose to, is to share your story. And my invitation for you is a practice that we also call narrative inquiry. It's when we actually truly can learn about ourselves and to really categorize what type of experiences that we have had, both as a professional working in the field, but also as that caregiver, that person who has had different experiences. Each and every one of us are knowledge holders to our own story. We experienced it, we have lived it. So, when we think about these practices and this tradition of storytelling, my invitation for you is to think about that notion of narrative inquiry. This is a way where we can find hope in our shared stories. It's a way we can make meaning through our stories. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to find a silver lining, because sometimes there isn't a silver lining in some of the tragedy and the setback and the hurts of our stories, but there is meaning. And there's a difference between a silver lining and meaning. Meaning means that it has something of impact, that we know that there is tradition, something in that experience is held for us to have lessons to be learned. So I can share with you, working with persons all around the world, usually where we're able to form connection is through our sharing. It is through our storytelling. And I am very fortunate that I grew up in a household in my family system where my father is a very brilliant storyteller. He can recount stories of our family's history, of his experiences, and something that I honor and I really celebrate is what it looks like to carry on our oral traditions. So, in the spirit of sharing and learning, my invitation for you is to think about, what is your story? What would it sound like? What would the title of your story be? What would each chapter be about? Through this action of exploring our story, and again, we might not ever share it with anyone, but it is for ourselves to do a deeper dive into an area that sometimes is the last frontier of what we really know about ourselves. And part of resiliency is owning our own story. It's very easy in our society to pick up stories and storylines and even plots that other people put on us, other people put on our day. I know I recently talked to a mother whose little one was born with an exceptionality, and she said, Robin, it was a great tragedy to everyone except to me. She said, I got to be with that perfect little baby. She said to everyone else, there was loss, and they were so, they didn't even know what to say to me. But she said, I knew I was meant to be her mother. So again, my invitation for you is to think about your story that you are writing, not what the world tells about you, because the world doesn't know you the way you know yourself. And I can share with you, as a scholar, I spend a lot of time hearing stories, but in this moment, I'm choosing to pause and turning the table. And I want to tell you a little bit about my story in terms of how I became a scholar who studies resiliency and how I became the author of my own resiliency journey. Now, I grew up in a very traditional household. I had hardworking parents. My family immigrated to Canada from Scotland years back, and we were a traditional family, right? There was my mother, my father, my brother, and I, and we were doing our thing. And my parents loved me very much, and I grew up in a house with a lot of love. Now, when I was really little, I recall that my mother had a lot of confidence in me. My mom thought that I was a really good problem solver. My mom thought I was pretty crafty of kind of figuring my way through the world. And I was very emboldened to be me. Now, when I was little, she also mentioned things like Robyne can do hard things. My mom believed in my capacity to problem solve. And I didn't really know what that meant. And I had some setbacks and some challenges, but for the most part, it was a pretty traditional, uneventful childhood. But somehow, as I approached my adolescence, I was derailed and I went through a very challenging season. And it felt sudden, but in reflection, it was a slow, steady erosion of my confidence, of my capacity. I struggled with some pretty big mental blocks around understanding worthiness and feeling love. And I ended up getting into the wrong crowd, really. I ended up finding people who held such a low standard for themselves that it was easy to assimilate. Now, we also moved around a little bit, and I had changed high schools, and every school, it just became harder and harder for me to try and fit in. And when you don't know how to fit in, you pretty much become that outsider. And in that season of being an outsider, I got very lost. Now, by the time I actually hit 16, I was navigating a major mental health condition. I was navigating addictions, and I had already dropped out of high school. I pretty much, school hated me and I hated it right back. It was a terrible experience and a very difficult season for me in my last high school. And I recall at that 16, when I did drop out of school and I was in a very dark season, my parents loved me so hard, but helplessly. They could not get me on track. I resisted all interventions and supports. Now, during that difficult season, it was very hard on my family. And I recall I also happened to get my driver's license. My family lived in kind of rural Ontario and there wasn't transit. So 16-year-olds got their driver's license. And I recall I had mine just for about a week. And I was driving home one night by myself late at night. And I was on a deserted road. And within moments, a snowstorm rolled in. It was like a blizzard. And within moments, I lost control of that car I was driving. My car went off the road. My car actually went off this small embankment, and my vehicle crashed through the ice, and my vehicle sank in the Otonabee River with me trapped inside. Within moments, my car was completely engulfed in frigid water. And I recall in that moment that I wasn't actually feeling afraid. I wasn't feeling fear. I was actually feeling a little bit angry. I was feeling angry that I could not protect my families, especially my mom, from what was about to happen. That after all we had been through, her daughter was going to die in a car accident like this. And when I started to think about my mom, it was as if there was this like emotional echo that rang through my bones that said, Robyne can do hard things. And I remember in that moment, I made the decision to survive. I remember I had my winter boots on and my winter coat on. The water pressure was so great, I couldn't even get the seatbelt out. So I had to wiggle out through the seatbelt. I recall wiggling out through that seatbelt and I couldn't open the car door. The water pressure, I would never have been able to get it open. So I had to escape through the window. I recall swimming through that window and having no idea of my bearings. I couldn't tell which way was up or down. They estimate my vehicle was between 15 and 20 feet underwater. And I realized the only way to get my bearings was if I let go of my breath that I was holding, because I knew my bubbles would rise. And I recall swimming as hard as I could after those bubbles. And then all of a sudden there was this like hot, like ripping pain along my jawline around the side of my face. And I couldn't figure out what was happening. And I realized it was actually my face hitting the ice and I was pinned under the ice. I remember having waves of exhaustion, waves of just wanting it to be over, but just kept on fighting. I recall I swam deeper into the dark, deeper into the channel to see if I could find a place to get out. I remember getting my torso onto an ice shield in the middle of the channel. Now, that night, there was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Todd. He was just a random guy in his 30s driving home from shift work. And Joseph just happened to see my car tracks in the snow going off the road. And he just happened to drive all along the side of the road to see if he could see anyone. Joseph came upon me out on the ice. And again, this was a channel and I was out far from the shoreline. He pulled over his truck. He got wood out of the back of his truck and a chain. He made an X with the wood to support his weight. He crawled out onto the ice. He threw the chain, wrapped it around my body, and he dragged me to shore. Joseph Todd was awarded the Governor General's Award for bravery, for risking his life to save a stranger that night. And I recall I woke up in the hospital and, my mom and my dad were there. And I remember talking to my mom and she was so curious, how was I able to do that? How was I able to get out of it? And I recall, sharing with her that, she said I could do hard things. I remember her thinking that was not what we ever thought about. That's not what we signed up for. But what I learned that night was the origin story as to why I study human resiliency, because I believe in the human condition. I believe in a comeback. I also believe that our days will be fulfilled and we have a reason for being here. There's work still left to be done. And whenever I do my work, I always give thanks and recognition to Joseph Todd, because I don't think any act of bravery should ever be forgotten. And reflecting on that, I always think it's so important. People are very interested in my origin story. I understand why. There's a sensational component to surviving something like that. But I also know that recoveries are not linear. It wasn't as if I just had this like TSN turning point and then all of a sudden at 16, I righted myself. That was a significant event, but recoveries tend to be long and they tend to be a little bit wobbly. No story is just one event. Our stories are a series of events. And often those mistakes or those setbacks, they're part of a bigger story. Now, I was able to get myself back on track with the support of my family. I was able to finish high school through correspondence. And for folks who might not remember correspondence, this is where I would in the mail, I would get my homework and then I would do my homework and I would mail it to a teacher I had never met. And that teacher would mark it and send it back. And I was able to cobble together my grade 11 year. And then in grade 12, I was able to go back into a school. Now, what was interesting is I knew very quickly that education and learning was going to be key to my recovery. Finding out my skill sets, figuring out where I could be of service. I knew that was going to be important, but I didn't have the whole trajectory mapped out. I just knew that I had to keep learning and I needed to keep a humble heart. Now, I can share with you many, many years later, when I finally finished my doctorate education, I remember being at my convocation and my family was there and my children were there, the 3 kids and my husband and my father. And I recall saying to Jax, my littlest one at the time, I'm like, Jax, he asked who all these people were in Convocation Hall. And I shared with Jackson, I said, Jax, these are my classmates. These are the people I graduated with. And Jackson looked at me with these big little eyes and he's like, wow, Mom, they are so young. How long did this take you? And of course, the truth from little ones, right? And I said, Jax, this took your mom about 20 years. It took me about 20 years to get back on track and continue my journey as a scholar. And I said, but I wouldn't change it. This is what worked for me. This is part of my story. This legacy is important to me. Jackson looked at me and he said, Mom, we talk about you in school. We talk about people like you in school. And I thought, really? You talk about women who are, running research programs and authors and that are pulling together kind of this comeback story. Jax, you talk about women like me in school. And he smiled and he said, no, Mom, we talk about slow learners. And, and you know what? He was right. I did take a non-linear route. I was a bit of a slow learner, but I also know that experiences that we pick up within our story, we can use that to be of service to others. We can share. We are able to be able to find stories of hope and persistence. The stories that we have, these are our stories, and our stories make up really who we are. And my invitation for you in the very important work that you do, there's no story that's too small. There's no story that doesn't have a lesson to be learned or something to be shared upon. My invitation for you is to lean into your stories. Don't let other people write them for you. Take ownership. You have a story to tell. And when we reflect on our stories, I hope you come upon these truths that you are stronger than maybe you would have thought, or maybe you're braver than you knew, or maybe you're more resilient than you're giving yourself credit for. At the end of the day, when all is said and done, our goal needs to be to find this alignment between our head and our heart and our purpose. So, as we practice the everyday resiliency, I hope you learn in our time together that events and circumstances, those aren't characteristics. Those are just things that happen, but we can braid our story together to find hope, to find confidence that come what may, we will be okay. And that's something I believe because I know we can do hard things. And I thank you for your service. And I thank you for finding a way to make the next right decision so you can be of service to yourself and to others. So, in closing, I wish to sign off by saying all the best to you and to yours. And I hope our paths cross again. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech, and take good care. Bye for now.